October 4th, 2010. On the morning of that day, Gap updated its website.
Oh yeah, it caused such a controversy. Last week, the Gap introduced a new logo on its website, and an overwhelming number of people on the interweb were not happy with the new design.
By the morning of October 11th, it was over. For 24 years, Gap had carried one of the most recognized logos in American retail. A dark blue box, 3 tall white letters, instant recognition. Then Gap replaced it with a plain black word mark and a small blue square tucked behind the last letter. An identity that looked less like Gap and more like something built in an afternoon. The company may have seen modernization. The public saw a brand dismantling one of its strongest assets. Designers mocked it, customers rejected it, a developer turned it into a game anyone could play, and within 7 days the new logo was dead. This was not just a design failure. The agency behind it was already being replaced before the logo went live. No one with the authority to protect the brand was in the room. And by the time anyone noticed, a physical rollout across thousands of stores was already impossible to stop. One brand, one logo, 1 week. This is the story of how Gap killed its own logo. The blue box was born in 1986, at a time when American retail was becoming noisier, louder, and more promotional. Gap moved in the opposite direction. Simple, bold, unmistakable, a blue square, white serif letters, Gap, nothing else. And for 24 years, through recessions, through the rise of the internet, through the entire collapse and rebuild of how people shop, it did not need to change. That staying power was not accidental. It was the result of a logo doing exactly what a logo is supposed to do. You could see it on a storefront, on a shopping bag, on a label, or across a mall. And the message arrived before you had time to process it. This is Gap. That is what brand equity looks like when it becomes visual memory. The logo becomes a shortcut. The customer recognizes a pattern, not a design. By 2010, Gap had real problems. Online shopping was accelerating. Fast fashion was taking market share. Sales had been declining for years. The desire to modernize was understandable. The instinct to start with a logo was not. Because the old logo was not the problem. It was one of the few things about Gap that still worked. Without question, without effort, without explanation. Changing it was not modernization. It was pulling out the one anchor that still held. On October 4th, 2010, the new logo appeared quietly on Gap's website. No press release, no campaign, no explanation. Almost everything familiar had been removed. The blue box was gone as the central structure. The tall white serif letters were gone. In their place, a lowercase black word mark with a small blue square floating behind the final letter, as if the old design had been broken apart and only a fragment survived. It looked cleaner, more minimal, more digital, but it also looked like it could belong to anyone. That was the problem. The agency behind this design was Laird and Partners, Gap's creative partner for nearly a decade. In their advertising campaigns for Gap, they had already been moving away from the blue box for years. Helvetica in the headlines, cleaner layouts, the iconic logo pushed further and further to the margins. The redesign was not a sudden decision. It was the logical endpoint of an agency slowly eroding the very asset they were supposed to protect. But there was something else happening while this logo was being built. In the summer of 2010, months before the logo went live, Gap had already opened an agency review. They were in active discussions with a new creative partner to replace Laird & Partners. The team building Gap's most expensive and visible creative project was already being replaced by their own client. They were designing a logo for a company that had already decided to move on, and the agency was not the only problem. When this logo launched, Gap had never had a global chief marketing officer. Not one. One of the largest retail chains in America had no single person whose job it was to protect the brand. Nobody was asking the customer's question. Customers do not live inside the brand department. They see the logo for a few seconds, while shopping, scrolling, walking past a store. For them, familiarity is not the problem. Familiarity is the product. Gap missed that entirely, and by the time the logo appeared online, the supply chain was already in motion. Shopping bags, hang tags, store signage, printed for over 3,000 locations. The $100 million figure was not a design fee. It was the cost of a physical rollout that had already started and could not be quietly stopped. The old logo felt owned, the new one felt rented, and when a brand trades an ownable asset for a generic one, people notice, especially when nobody asked for it. The redesign did not fail quietly. It failed in public, and it took less than 24 hours. By the end of the first day, the logo was already trending. Thousands of tweets, blog posts, and design forums had reached the same verdict: this is worse. Then came the moment that turned a backlash into a disaster. A developer built a tool that let anyone create their own version of the new Gap logo. Same font, any words, in seconds. It spread instantly. Suddenly the rebrand was not being criticized. It was being turned into a comedy prop. Gap's response made it worse. Rather than defending the decision or going silent, Marka Hansen, Gap's North America brand president, publicly invited customers to submit their own logo ideas online. The message that sent was worse than the logo itself. It told the world that Gap had launched a major brand change without confidence in the outcome. The logo stopped being a design object. It became evidence. Evidence that the company had overestimated how much customers wanted something new, and underestimated how much they valued what already existed. Once that interpretation took hold, Gap was no longer defending a logo. It was defending its judgment. Easy to understand, easy to share, impossible to walk back. On October 11th, 2010, 7 days after the launch, Gap confirmed it was returning to the original logo. The blue box came back, the white letters came back, and the new logo became a case study before the month was over. A fast reversal can be the right move, but it has a price. Hold your ground and you look stubborn. Reverse in a week and you look like you never had a plan. Gap paid the second price. The deeper damage was not visual, it was institutional. A rebrand is supposed to say, we know who we are, and we know where we are going. Gap's reversal said the opposite. It said, we launched something we were not ready to defend. The blue box had survived 2 decades of retail transformation. It did not survive 1 week inside its own company. But that was not where the story ended. 3 months after the reversal, on February 4th, 2011, Marka Hansen stepped down as president of Gap North America. She had been with the company for 24 years. At the same moment, Gap terminated Laird & Partners. A creative relationship that had lasted nearly a decade ended, and Gap created a position it had never had before: a global chief marketing officer for the first time in the company's history. A role that had not existed when any of this was happening. Before we get into what Gap should have done differently, one quick thing. Every week, Brand Misfire breaks down exactly why strong brands fail, and what everyone else can learn from it. If you do not want to miss the next one, subscribe and hit the bell. It takes 2 seconds. The obvious lesson is, do not make a bad logo. But the real lesson is harder to sit with. Gap did not fail because the design was ugly. Gap failed because the organization forgot what the design was for. And because no one with the authority to ask the right question was in the room. Some designers at the time defended the new logo. They called it cleaner, more contemporary, better suited for digital screens and smaller formats. They were not wrong about what it was, they were wrong about what it needed to be. A logo does not exist to impress designers. It exists to be recognized by customers, and recognition is not built in a week. It is built over decades. A logo is compressed memory. 24 years of customer recognition, stored in a blue square and 3 letters. You do not replace that. You inherit it. Consider FedEx. Their logo contains a hidden arrow, the negative space between the E and the X. Most customers have never noticed it, but FedEx has refined that logo across decades without ever touching the arrow, because the arrow is not a design trick. It is the memory. Gap's equivalent was the blue box, and they removed it entirely. Every brand has a blue box, the one thing customers recognize without thinking. The question Gap never asked is the one worth asking yourself. Do you know what yours is? And would you recognize it before you threw it away? Tell us in the comments. A safer redesign would have asked a different question, not, does this look modern? But what does the customer actually own in their memory? And what can we change without breaking that? The mistake Gap made was the most visible kind, removing the part that people recognized and replacing it with the part that looked like everyone else. Gap had spent 24 years building something customers recognized without thinking, and in 7 days they discovered exactly what it was worth. Not from a focus group, from a parody logo generator that anyone with a browser could use. In branding, the customer always votes. Gap got the results in a week. The most expensive logo Gap ever had cost nothing to design. It was the one they already owned.